and these are being archived as reflections on race on the playlist on my channel. So good morning, good morning, good morning. We are continuing our book talk. Our newest book talk is White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son by Tim Wise. And we are on the second section of his book called Awakenings. And so we're going to get right into it in just a minute. I'm just giving an opportunity for those who need to come on to come on. Hope everybody's having a great day. And today, he is going to cover some things about his early childhood education, which is very, very interesting. And that's where we're going to stop today. So good morning to those of you who are coming in. Good morning, good morning. And I'm going to go ahead and go into a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for this goodness. Thank you for your grace. Thank you, Father, for another day of life, another day of health, another day of strength, things that we don't take for granted. Help us, Father God, not to take even the people in our life for granted, that you allow us to impact, the ones that you allow us to come into contact with today. Lord God, as we go into this reading today, I pray, Father God, that this would be something that would edify, encourage, enhance, strengthen, educate, motivate, and bring revelation to our lives and how we can touch the lives of others in Jesus' name. Amen. So if you're here, give me a thumbs up. And I noticed that it seems like people are going back in and out. But if you are here, give me a thumbs up or a good morning. We're going into the next section of Tim Wise's reading on his life. And he's starting out by talking about his early preschool years. And I will probably have a few things to say about that as an educator myself, having taught K through 12 all subjects, and having been invested in the public education system, private school education system, and alternative school. I can tell you a lot about their differences and a lot about their similarities, and a little bit about their administration processes, and just some things that I've seen in the American school system that does not benefit a child who is what I call above average or gifted. I often tell people, if your child is above average or gifted, you may definitely want to look at a private school setting or even a homeschool setting, because for the most part, public school is designed as normalized education, meaning it's for the average student. This is why many times that student who is brighter, or that student who is gifted, or that student who has multiple talents often gets in trouble and gets mislabeled very early on in their education setting as a troublemaker. So in order to avoid that, I often do recommend that parents make sure you're finding an educational environment that is conducive to your child's gifts so that your child can grow. All right, so here we go. Awakenings. For whites, the process of racial identity development is typically far slower than for people of color. As the dominant group in the United States, whites too often have the luxury of remaining behind a veil of ignorance for years, while people of color begin noticing the different ways in which they are viewed and treated early on. Now, Tim starts out making a very good point here, and that is as young as, and I know in my case, personally, 5 years old, Black children start to notice, or really it gets told to them, right, in many cases, that they are different, or that they are different because of the color of their skin. I will give you just my own personal example, because I don't like to bring other people in on certain subjects. But in my case, I was about 5 years old when I realized that there was an issue because of my skin color, right? I went to a school where I was in the gifted program. I was a young kid, and I had this, one little white guy friend, and we would just, we just loved each other. We loved each other, very, very innocent. And we would walk around the school, and we were really, really close friends. And, we would go around the school, and at cafeteria time, we would come together and we'd be talking. And he was just my really good friend, and we'd be holding hands and walking around the cafeteria. And I remember hearing people say, "Oh, that's so cute. Oh, look at them. That's so cute," right? But a couple of weeks later, that same little white boy came to me and said, "I can no longer be your friend." And I looked at him and I'm like, "Why can't you be my friend? We've been friends this whole time. Like, what's going on?" And he said to me, "I can no longer be your friend because my dad said I can't marry a Black woman." Now, he was 5. He was 5, but his family was already socializing him that there was something wrong with Black skin. Okay? And at 5 years old, that was the first time I came into contact with another child who told me that there was something wrong with me because of my skin color, right? So, did that affect me? I'm 38. I still remember it. Okay? So, there's certain things that happen in particular ages, especially in your early childhood, that may happen to you that does not leave your memory, right? So what Tim Wise is saying here to start out is that as the dominant group in the United States, white children have the luxury of remaining behind a veil of ignorance for years, while people of color may have to introduce their children to certain things right off the bat, because we would love to believe that our society does not judge people by skin color, but the reality is that they do. So you can't leave your child, as much as you would like them to not be exposed to the ills of the world and the injustices of the world, you can't leave your child ignorant, meaning you can't leave your child in a state where they don't realize that people are coming against them or teaching their children something that's contrary. So it is okay to arm your child so they're not caught off guard and traumatized by the way that society treats skin color. Now, there are ways to do that. There are books out there on how to introduce your child to these things, but to just simply say to your child, "Everybody loves," regardless, is not telling your child the truth. And I don't believe in Santa Claus and Easter Bunny stories to children, especially around something as important as this, because it can cause detriment and damage to them, and they will be caught off guard. And then you will be having to repair trauma, rather than educating and teaching your child that Black is beautiful, that it doesn't matter what skin color you are, and that there are people in the world who may treat you differently because of your skin color, but know that God created you in His image and in His likeness, and God liked the way that He created you. So if somebody has a problem with that, then here's what you say. That's a totally different approach than leaving your child in the dark and then they're being inundated with these feelings of disgust or whatever, or dislike or prejudice or whatever about their skin color. And now they're coming home to mom, they're coming home to dad, they're totally shocked, they're upset, they're wounded, they're hurt, because you sent them out into a world that was going to judge them on something and you didn't prepare them for that reality. Okay. I'd love to get to a place in our country and in our world where we don't have to prepare Black and brown children that they may be attacked for the color of their skin, but we're not there yet. Okay, we're not there yet. All right, so I'm moving on. Recent studies suggest that even by the age of 8, and certainly by 10, Black children are cognizant of the negative stereotypes commonly held about their group. Folks of color know they are the other, and pretty soon they learn what that means. Thank you for commenting, Mr. Dangerfield, and thank you for those who are in the room that I may not be able to see at this point. What's more, welcome, Apostle. What's more, people of color not only recognize their otherness, but are also inundated by whiteness being the norm. Sort of like that kid in the movie The Sixth Sense who sees dead people. To be Black or brown is to see white people often. It's hard to work around us. So he starts out and he's talking about the fact that racial identity development happens far slower for white America than it does for children of color, because children of color in our society are often first inundated with negative stereotypes about themselves, whereas white Americans generally aren't. Okay, so that's what he's talking about here. And if you listen, or if you've listened or you've heard any of the younger children of this generation right now, many of them are talking about the police shootings. Why? Because we're showing that all times of day, all times of night, and rerunning it. So when a child looks up and they see this, all they're seeing on television, not that that is the only case, but all they're seeing on television is Black and brown men getting shot down in the streets. So think about what that's doing to the younger generation. Because to them, they look and they're like, that could be my dad, that could be my uncle, that could be my brother, right? Or they're looking at the anger and they're looking at the response of adults concerning the football player Colin Kaepernick. Children are very impressionable, and our generation is feeding them a whole new level of negative stereotypes about Black and brown people. This is what's happening, right? So off, in my opinion, off is the best button when it comes to television, but do what you need to do for your own family. So he says by age 8 and certainly by 10 that research shows Black children are cognizant of negative stereotypes commonly held about their people group. But for whites, we don't often see people of color. To be white in this country has long been to be in a position where, if you wanted to, you could construct a life that would be more or less all white. Now, this is actually research as well. I believe the figures, I would have to, I believe these are the correct figures, but I believe it's like 70% of white people do not have Black friends. It's really high. I'm gonna find the research on it and make sure I put the link in at the bottom so you guys can check it out. But it's really high. It's like 70% of white people don't have any white friends. I mean, Black friends. So what does that mean? That means that if you don't have any Black people that you are in contact with, you're getting all of your information about Black America from media. And media is propaganda. So, of course, you're going to have a skewed idea about Black people if you don't work with Black people. There's no Black people in your neighborhood. There's no Black people in your church. There's no Black people in your gym. In other words, he's saying that the reality is in this country, you can construct a life without people of color in it. It's very easy for a white person to do that. You can escape into whiteness and not have to deal with Black people or brown people at all. Matter of fact, one of my friends, she was talking to my husband and I, and she told us, she said, I had not seen a Black person in person until I was 15. Think about that. She had never physically laid eyes on a Black person in person until she was 15. And then because she was staring at that Black person, because she had never seen one in person, that person perceived her staring at them like a freak show, so they got defensive with her. But she was basically saying that she was staring because she had never seen a Black person in person to be able to engage with them herself. So what he's saying is true. Okay. Although the demographic changes underway in the nation, which by 2040 will render the United States about half white and half people of color, are making it more difficult to maintain racially homogeneous spaces. In many parts of the country, white youth grow up with very little connection to anyone who isn't white. That's just where we are right now. So you still have a country that if you wanted to not mix with other people, if you wanted to be in an all-white setting, is what he's saying, you could manage to do that in our country. Which, culturally, if you're trying to understand other people, you want to try to get your information from a first-hand source and not from media propaganda. He goes on to say, even in 2011, I meet white folks all around the country who never really knew any person of color until they came to college. This would explain, in many cases, the friction that is now happening on a lot of our college campuses. Because you have people who have not come into contact with people of color, whatever their ideas and ideologies are about people of color meets a head-on collision with the actual people of color on college campuses. And as we have seen last year and this year, the rise of things that have to do with hate crimes, the rise of the swastika symbols being spray painted places in college, the rise of making fun of African Americans and lynching and blackface and all of that has been on the rise, right? Because he's talking about the fact that many white people around the country never knew a person of color until they came to college. So you're coming into contact with a culture that you have not had real contact with except by television, media, and what television and media shows you or portrays about that particular culture. Okay? So that's what is happening. In some cases, they had hardly even seen people of color other than on television until then. So again, if you're getting your information just by media and you're not getting your information from actually getting to know people of color, you need to check your information and say, is this true, what I know about people of color, or is this media propaganda? Okay. That's the same, that's on the other side too with people of color. Is what I know about white people true? Or is this media propaganda? Do I have white friends? Did I go to school with white people? Did I get to know white people outside of what media has shown me, or is this propaganda? And unfortunately, in our country, we have a lot of propaganda that is feeding the hatred on both sides. All right, we're going to keep reading. Though perhaps it shouldn't surprise me, in part it does, because such insularity is so foreign to my own experience. Those of you coming in, we are reading an excellent book called White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son by Tim Wise. Tim Wise is an anti-racism activist who deals with the subjects of white privilege, white supremacy, and racism in our society. And right now we're reading from his own personal childhood and accounts of how racism and race impacted his childhood. Yes. Fact is, I remember the first time I ever saw a black person too. I mean, really saw them and intuited that there was something different about our respective skin colors. But that memory is not a college memory or a teenage memory. Rather, it is my very first memory from my childhood. I must have been about 2, so it would have been perhaps the fall of 1970 or maybe the spring of 1971. I was in the living room of our apartment, gazing as I often did out of the sliding glass door to the porch, when about 200 feet away, cutting across the rectangular lawn used as a common recreation space by residents of the complex, came striding a tall, middle-aged black man in some kind of uniform. The man, I would come to learn, was named Tommy, and he was one of the maintenance crew at the Royal Arms. It is testimony to how entrenched racism was at that time and place that this man, who was at least in his 50s by then, would never be known to me or my parents by anything other than his first name. Even as a mere infant, I would be allowed the privilege of addressing this grown black man with a family and full life history only as Tommy, as if we were equals, or perhaps Mr. Tommy, as my mother would instruct, since at least that sounded more respectful, but about him I would need to know nothing else. As I gazed out the window, my attention was riveted to him in the darkness of his skin. He was quite dark, though not really black, of course, which led me to ask my mother who the brown man was. Without hesitation, she said it was Mr. Tommy, and that he wasn't brown but black. Now, having developed a penchant for argument even at 2, I insisted naturally that he most certainly was not black. He was brown. I knew the names of all the crayons in my Crayola box and knew that this man certainly did not look like a crayon called black. Burnt umber, maybe. Brown, most definitely. But black? No way. My mother acknowledged the accuracy of my overtly literalistic position, but stuck to her guns on the matter, explaining something rather profound in the process, the profundity of which it took many years for me to appreciate. Tim, she explained, Mr. Tommy may look brown, but people who look the way Mr. Tommy looks does prefer to be called black. And that was the end of the argument. Even at 2, it seemed only proper that if someone wanted to call themselves black, they had every right to do so, whether or not the label fit the actual color of their skin. Mine, after all, wasn't really white either, and so it was really none of my business. This may not seem important, but think how meaningful it can be to learn early on that people have a right to their own self-determination, to define their own reality, to claim their own identity, and that you have no right to impose your judgment on them. When it comes to race, that's not a lesson that most white people learn at the age of 2 or sometimes ever. Historically, white Americans have always felt the right to define black and brown folks' reality for them, insisting that enslaved persons were happy on a plantation and felt just like family, or that indigenous persons were the uncivilized ones, while those who would seek to conquer and destroy them were the practitioners of enlightenment. At the level of labels, racism has long operated to impose white reality onto others. Whites found the assertion of blackness, especially as positive and even beautiful, threatening because it was an internally derived title, unlike colored or Negro, terms which had been foisted upon black bodies by the white and European tradition. Now, let me give a little history lesson right here. Even in today's society, people still find an assertion of black being beautiful as threatening. Let it sink in. Just look from 2015 to 2016, that the whole notion of expressing any kind of solidarity or pride, or the fact that black is beautiful in any way, shape, or form, people lose their cotton picking minds. Pardon the expression. People lose their minds over this. Oh my gosh, black people wearing black all together. There must be a threat. Women dancing at the Super Bowl with afros. There must be a threat there somewhere, right? So this notion of asserting your blackness as something positive or as something beautiful is something that people have found threatening even back in the 60s and back in the 70s, right? And the term Negro or Negro actually comes from a particular place in Africa. I'm gonna give you some homework, give you a little bit of homework, okay? Negro was not just a random term that was picked out to identify blacks coming over to this country who were taken from the slave coast. The word Negro actually refers to an area of land that they were taking blacks from. It's on many of the maps in the 1730s and the 1740s, and that area of Africa was called Negro land. Now, if you do a little further research into what Negro land was, you're going to find that Negro land was where some of the Hebrews landed after they escaped East Africa and Rome. They migrated all the way over to the coast of West Africa, and there was a whole strip there that everybody knew during that time was called Negro land, and they were displaced Hebrews. Now let that sink in. Okay, they were displaced Hebrews, and right below Negro land was what they called the little strip. There was the Gold Coast, and then there was the Slave Coast. It was an actual section in Africa where people were going up into that coastal area, right? Where they were taking blacks from Negro land to that slave coast and sending them to different parts of the world. But that's another history lesson for another time. But if you'd like to research Negro land and find out who was in Negro land, you'll find out who Black Americans really are. All right? So we're going to move on. So it wasn't just this whole derogatory title Negro, which turned into Niger, which turned into nigger, wasn't just a random term given to Black Americans that came off slave ships. Okay, so we're moving on. Likewise, many whites today react hostilely to the use of the term African American because it came from within the Black community. Now, I don't argue with people about whether they choose to use the term African American, whether they choose to use the term Black. That's up to them. As he said, you have a right of self-determination. If you want to use Jesse Jackson's term for yourself, you go right ahead. But he says that people don't like Black Americans using that term because it didn't come from a label that was put on them. It came from within the Black community. And as such, it stands as a challenge to white linguistic authority. Language matters. Remember, this goes even back to biblical history. Language matters the ability to name something matters. When you name it, you are taking the authority over it, right? This is why Hananiah and Azariah and Mishael, right? All of them were renamed after they came into Babylonian captivity, because what? They were taking authority over their identity. So he was saying, in the same way that when Black Americans decided what they were going to call themselves, they began to take over authority of their own identity. And that, of course, ticked some people off. When whites tell Black folks, as we often do, that they should just be Americans and drop the whole hyphen thing, we are forgetting that it's hard to just be an American when you've rarely been treated like a full and equal member of the family. Now, I'm going to sip some tea on that. You keep telling Black people that they should be proud to be an American, because at least I know I'm free, right? These songs are just coming. So you're telling them, just call yourself an American. But as he points out, you're rarely treating them as full and equal members of this American family, but you want them to just call themselves American. More to the point, it isn't our hyphen to drop, but it's always hard to explain such matters to those who have taken for granted, because we could, that we had the right to set the parameters of national identity or to tell other people's stories as if they were our own. In other words, you've been in charge for so long, right? You've been in the authority or the place of superiority for so long that it's hard for you, even as Martin Luther King said, it's hard for you to let go of the mentality of master, which tells a servant what to do, and to see yourself as a fellow brother, which means you don't get to decide other people's identification. All right? So he said, in the past, white people had the right to set the parameters of Black people's identity, but they no longer have the right to do that. So if we want to call ourselves the Oompa Loompas of the United States, we have the right to self-determination. I know that's funny, but we have the right to self-determination. You don't have the right anymore to set the parameters of a person or a people group's identity. That's the point that he's making. All right? It's been that way for a while and explains much about the way we misteach history. Right? We just came out of for many states, Columbus Day. Well, in school, I just had an educator share with me that, she was getting flack in the public school system. She was getting flack because they had a choice in their school as to whether or not they were going to teach about Columbus on Columbus Day. And she chose for her classes that she was not going to teach about Columbus on Columbus Day, and her Caucasian educators flipped out. Well, why are you flipping out? Do you really want me to share the history of Columbus with these children? The real history, not the one that's in the, the coloring book, perforated, whitewashed curriculum version of Columbus, but what did Columbus actually do? So we have states now that are no longer celebrating Columbus Day, and they're actually replacing it with Indigenous Peoples Day. Why? Because if we're honest about the history of Columbus, he really wasn't a hero. Okay? He invaded he raped, he pillaged, he was even tried by his own king and queen back home. He and his brothers who came over with him were sent to jail for several months. So there was a penalty that he had to pay for the atrocities that he committed in the New World. This is not in, I'm an educator, I've been teaching for 15 years. This is not in any history book that I've seen in the public school setting. So we've got to be willing to hold our educational systems accountable for whitewashing history and making teachers teach things that are simply not there. So again, he's talking about the fact that because we misteach history, if you teach history correctly, listen, if you teach history correctly according to public school, it's almost impossible for white Americans to graduate from high school without having a measure of superiority about themselves. And it's almost impossible for Black Americans to graduate from that same high school without having a measure of inferiority about themselves, because of the way that history is taught. If all of your relatives are seen as the world conquerors and the great inventors, etc., and all of my relatives, in most history books, we started as slavery. And then from slavery, we were subjugated through peonage. Then from peonage, we were subjugated through Jim Crow laws. And then we finally, got a measure of rights with the civil rights movement, which are now being stripped by our Supreme Court. Listen, there's no possible way you can teach that history that way and not have white students come out thinking that they're the best thing in the entire world, and not have Black students come out thinking that there's something inferior about me in my beginnings. Okay, so that's something for you and your local school board to look at. Look at your curriculum, look at the books that they're picking out. And they do textbook reviews where they send out a notice and say, hey, we're changing the textbooks. Parents have an opportunity to come in and look at these textbooks and see what is being taught. And I would say go straight to your science books and go straight to your history books. And that will tell you the ideology that your school system believes in. Just a little tip, just a little tip, just a little tip. All right, we're moving on. So at roughly the same time as I was being instructed by my mother on the finer points of linguistic determination, I was also beginning to read. I read my first book without help on May 5th, 1971, at the age of 2 years, 7 months, and 1 day. That's the good and reasonably impressive news. The bad news, amen. The bad news is that the book I was reading was called Meet Andrew Jackson, an 87-page tribute to the nation's 7th president, intended to make children proud of the nation in which they live, and all of this, one of that nation's early leaders. Given that my mother had been quick to prohibit books like Little Black Sambo from coming into our home because of the racial stereotypes in which the story trafficked, it was somewhat surprising that she would indulge such a volume as this one, but she did, and I consumed it voraciously. Therein, I learned that Jackson's mom had admonished him to never lie or never take what is not your own, an instruction he felt free to ignore as he got older, at least as it applied to the indigenous people or the Africans whom he took as property. And that when Jackson headed west as a young man, he encountered Indians who did not want white people in their hunting grounds and often killed white travelers. This part was true, of course, if a bit incomplete. Remember, these were people whose land had been invaded and were in the process of being stolen. They often would become agitated and sometimes even kill those who were trying to destroy them. On page 46, I read that although some people in the North were saying it was not right to own slaves, Jackson felt the way most other Southerners did. He felt it was right to own slaves. He called his slaves his family. Well then, who are we to question his definition of that term? 10 pages later, I learned that Jackson fought the Creek Indians to preserve America and save innocent lives. Though oddly, there was no mention that in order to get an accurate count of the dead, they slaughtered at Horseshoe Bend. Soldiers in Jackson's command cut off the tips of the Indians' noses and sliced strips of their flesh from their body for use as bridle reins for their horses. Surely an accidental editorial oversight. At the end of the book, after recounting Jackson's rise to the presidency, Meet Andrew Jackson concludes by noting that when Jackson died, his slaves cried and sang a sad old song. To insert such a flourish as this, though it probably struck me as touching at the time, is vulgar and suggests, as well as anything, what is wrong with the way children in the United States have learnt our nation's history. There is no scholarly record of sad songs being sung by slaves as Jackson lay dying. This kind of detail, even if it were true, and almost certainly is not, has no value when it comes to letting us know who Andrew Jackson was. This kind of detail exists for the same reason the old fairy tale about George Washington cutting down the cherry tree and telling his dad because he couldn't tell a lie exists. Because no fabrication is too extreme in producing a national love of country. This is very important, what he is saying. Yes, that's fine. Anything that makes us feel proud can be said, regardless of whether it's true or not. Anything that reminds us of the not so noble pursuits of our forefathers or national heroes, on the other hand, gets dumped down the memory hole lane. And if you bring up those kinds of things, you will be accused of hating America. The way in which we place rogues like Andrew Jackson on a pedestal while telling people of color to get over it, meaning the past, whenever slavery or Indian genocide is brought up, has always struck me as irony. We want folks of color to move past the past, even as we very much seek to dwell in that place a little while. We dwell there every July 4th, every Columbus Day, every time a child is given a book like Meet Andrew Jackson to read. We love the past so long as it celebrates us. Wow. We want to be stuck there, and many would even like to return. Some say as much as with the Tea Party folks, who not only announce that they want their country back, but even dress up in the hats, the Revolutionary War costumes, powdered wigs for their rallies. It is only when those who were targets for destruction challenge the dominant narrative that the past becomes conveniently irrelevant and a trifle not worth dwelling upon. So he points out that we have no problem with the past, white America. That's who he's talking to in this book. He's saying white America doesn't really have a problem with the past when the past celebrates their past actions and accomplishments. It's only when you bring up things that don't put them in a positive light that all of a sudden it's, let's get over it. Why are we talking about this? And I know personally I've heard get over it several times, even within this year. So in other words, what he is saying is you got to face the good and you got to be willing to face the bad. That's the only way that you're going to begin to start walking in truth about our country. All right. I'm going to continue on. We've got about 10 more minutes. I'll probably read for another 5 and then close out. Good or bad, the past is a fact, and it often holds the keys to who we are in the present and who we're likely to become in the future. This was certainly the case for me. By 1971, it was time for me to begin preschool. Although I'm certain there were any number of programs in Green Hills, Tennessee, or thereabouts in which I could have been enrolled, my mother intentionally made the decision, very much against the objections of certain friends and family, that I should attend the early childhood program at Tennessee State University, which is Nashville's historically Black land-grant college. Her reasons for the decision were mixed. On the one hand, she knew that upon beginning school, I would be in an integrated environment, something she had never had the benefit herself of experiencing, and she wanted me to know what it was like to occasionally find myself in a space where I might not be the taken for granted norm. On the other hand, I've long suspected it was also something she did to tweak her family and mark her own independence from the much more provincial life she had led growing up. TSU, the name of which had recently been changed from Tennessee A&I, is located in North Nashville, just off the foot of Jefferson Street, the epicenter of Nashville's Black community. Although the Jefferson Street corridor had been recently devastated by construction of I-40 right through the middle of it, a part of the urban renewal that occurred nationwide and contributed to the destruction of up to 1/5 of all Black housing in the country by 1969, the city's Black residents were rightly proud of the area and constantly fought to return it to its former glory. My grandfather had grown up on Jefferson Street as a teen, since the Black community was one of the few places that Jews could live unless they were of substantial means. Of course, he hadn't gone to school there. During the days of segregation, he would be sent to the white school downtown, Hume Fogg, even though his neighborhood school was Pearl, one of the academic jewels among Southern Black high schools at the time. Not to romanticize the days of segregation, but under conditions of formal oppression, Black business districts like Jefferson Street had often managed to carve out a thriving subculture of Black success. When people talk about what did we lose with integration, a lot of what we lost with integration was Black business. A lot of what we lost with integration was Black people retaining the businesses that they had. So in this whole integration, I like to call it the illusion of inclusion to dissolve what you had. Because now we have less Black business. We have lots of marginalization going on in terms of Black people being able to find jobs and get loans and all of these different things. So a lot of things that were promised in integration never really took place. You integrated, but you lost a lot of those independent businesses that were a strength to Black communities. But again, that's a whole other history lesson. Forced to turn inward, African Americans across the nation spent their money with Black business. And the children in the schools knew that the teachers and administrators loved them. They were, after all, their neighbors. While integration was clearly necessary to open up opportunity that had previously been closed off, listen, it also led to the firing of thousands of Black teachers across the South, who were no longer wanted in the newly consolidated schools to which the Blacks would be placed. Because remember, I'm integrating you, but I'm also assimilating you, meaning that I'm going to integrate you with the understanding that I'm going to teach you that European culture is a little bit better than what you had. Remember, because they're integrating into something that they want equal rights for, but on the other hand of that, there is a sense of this notion of white is better. So with that integration, as he's pointing out, thousands of black teachers lost their jobs because they let the kids integrate. So where did that leave all of those educators that they didn't also integrate? Think about it. Integration would be of limited success because whites had been ill prepared to open up the gates of access and opportunity wide enough for any but a few to squeeze through. A few to squeeze through. Also known as tokenism, which MLK gave really, really good teaching on. You should check it out. Just type in MLK on tokenism. Those few managed to leave the old neighborhoods and take their money with them, but the rest were left behind. Access to suburban life was limited. Their own spaces were transformed by interstates, office buildings, and parking lots in the name of progress. So the way that things were constructed, in essence, pulled out black businesses for the most part and shut in and confined neighborhoods. So we're talking about what did integration actually do, right? What did all these housing, this urban renewal actually do? It set up communities for ghettos. That's what it did. And the interstates allowed whites to pass over those blighted areas that became blighted because of this quote unquote urban renewal, interstates, and all of that. So when you see something like Charlotte happen, it's a result of years of these kinds of projects. And that's why they took over one of their interstates, because that interstate actually represented something that was built that came through a neighborhood that caused that neighborhood to become blighted. So builders and constructors have to take a look at what they're doing as far as their projects, urban planning, and all of that. Is your urban planning actually benefiting the entire community? Or is your urban planning locking certain people into an area that they can't get out of? Right? MLK noted that it was arrogant for white people to think that they did not need to prepare or adjust to integration. Most of the focus and most of the emphasis in terms of integration was on how are black people going to fit in? What are black people going to do within our system? But MLK said it's pretty arrogant to think that you are also not going to have to shift, and you are not going to have to change, and you're not going to need to prepare, and you're not going to need to adjust. But that is in fact what happened. Just a mile or so from Fisk, the city's historically black private college, TSU was seen as the university for working class African Americans, and more to the point, for local black folks. While Fisk, long associated with W.E.B. Du Bois's talented 10th concept, attracted more of a national and international student clientele. At the time of my enrollment at TSU, the college was embroiled in a struggle with state officials who had been seeking to establish a branch campus of the University of Tennessee in downtown Nashville. Concerned that such a school would allow whites to avoid the mostly black campus by attending the predominantly white state institution in town, and therefore siphon resources from TSU to the newly created UT Nashville, TSU officials were battling valiantly to remain the flagship public education in the city. As a student in TSU's early childhood program, my classmates would be principally the children of faculty or family living in close proximity to the college, which is to say they would be mostly black. Indeed, I would be only one of 3 students in the class who weren't black, out of a class of roughly 20 kids. Although several of the teachers who ran the program were white, the ones I remember most vividly were African American women. They seemed quite clearly to own the space. It was their domain, and we all respected it. So I'm going to stop there for today. And tomorrow, we're going to get back into what Tim comes to realize even as a young preschooler in this integrated, in the mixed environment where his parents intentionally send him to a predominantly black preschool, and what he learns even as a young person being in that environment. I hope that you got something out of today's reading. I hope that your mind has been stirred. I hope that it will give you some things to think about in terms of your own life, in terms of your own connections, in terms of your own friendships. I hope it will give you some things to think about in terms of our current public school system. If we are going to tackle these issues of how we treat one another in this country, in this world, it's going to start with education. It's going to start with education. And with education, you got to add 2 more things to that, and that's called access and opportunity. A lot of people think, well, if you're educated, then yes, you do have a better chance in society. But we know, even with the statistics, the labor statistics right now, there are a lot of educated unemployed people or underemployed people. There are a lot of educated homeless people. So it's not just the education piece that matters. It's education, access, and opportunity. I can be as educated as I want to be, but if you don't give me access and you don't give me opportunity, then I'm still going to wind up in the same place as those who have no education. So that is what I have for you today. I hope that you will share this broadcast, and I will put the link down at the bottom in terms of some of the things that we talked about today about white America and their interaction with Black America. All right. So I hope you have a great day. Thank you for joining in. I will come back and read the comments because they were going kind of fast today. But thank you for joining. Take care and God bless.